I am General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, and I should like to reflect with you today about the ironies in my life that, as in the lives of everyone, had these instances about which I will speak gone the other way, my life would have been totally different. For example, in the spring of 1832, when I was a lad of 10, the spring melt was going on and the water in the creeks and rivers was up, and my boyhood chums and myself, including uh, Daniel Ammon and Jacob Ammon, brothers who grew up with me in Georgetown, uh, were all at White Oak Creek, and it was swollen and rushing in a torrent. Our parents, of course, had told us don't get in the water, and of course, we immediately got in the water. I jumped in to swim. I was always a good swimmer, but the torrent, as I said, carried me away, and I began to drown. I yelled for help, and Dan Ammon and his brother Jake Ammon, later in the war, Admiral Daniel Ammon and General Jacob Ammon, rushed downstream ahead of me, and Daniel grabbed a tree limb that had fallen off during the winter, thrust it in the water, and yelled, "Grab it, Liz, grab it!" And at the last moment, as I was going down and drowning, I was able to grab the limb. So Dan Ammon and his brother Jake pulled me to safety. I very narrowly missed drowning when I was 10. Later, when I was 16 and about to turn 17, my father, without my knowledge, secured for and got an appointment to the United States Military Academy. Now, he did this without my knowledge and certainly without my approval. I had no desire to be in the Army. The military life held no charms for me. Yet I found myself on the way to West Point. And painful for me was the fact that my best friend, Bart Bailey, who was the son of our local doctor, Dr. Bailey, who lived behind our home and in their home, Bart was a year older than I and had gone on to West Point, but he had not been successful and been asked to leave. So, to add anguish to my disappointment about not wanting to go to the academy, my slot, my opportunity to go to West Point was provided by the failure of my best friend. And I agonized over that greatly and still do. That even though there are those that tell you our history was changed by my doing so, that is not for me to say. That's for your discernment. But I got into West Point because of the failure of my best friend. When I was in Mexico during the war with the 4th Infantry, I did not have a combat assignment. I had been effective in handling supplies and was given a quartermaster assignment. And even though I wrote a letter protesting that vigorously and requested that I be relieved of my quartermaster duties, I was denied that request and I remained a quartermaster. However, I always went to the sound of the guns to be with my men, and consequently, I was in every battle in the Mexican War except Buena Vista. And the only reason I missed Buena Vista was because I was being transferred from General Taylor's army to General Scott's army, and the Battle of Buena Vista occurred during that time. So I really shouldn't have had combat experience, but I sought combat experience, and it has served me well. When the war started, I tried to get a commission. I had 15 years in the Army, including 4 years at West Point. I had been commissioned a captain in the regular Army before I resigned, and was trying to get back in. I'd been recruiting and drilling soldiers for Illinois, and could not get an appointment. I went to see General McClellan in Cincinnati, and he declined to see me for 2 days. Wrote a letter to the Adjutant General, and he never responded. And to this day has not responded to that letter. So I was very disappointed and greatly fearful that I was not going to be able to get back into the Army and into the war. But then Governor Richard Yates of Illinois, at what I felt to be the last minute, appointed me to be the colonel commanding of the newly formed 21st Illinois Volunteers. And I got back into uniform and in the Army as a colonel of volunteers. And I very narrowly did not have that opportunity. In November of '61, I had my first combat command in battle, took my troops, about 3,000 troops, to Belmont, Missouri, to find Confederate forces that were marauding and coming into southern Missouri, and had to be stopped. And when we went to Belmont, it was a pitched battle for 3 to 4 hours, and my troops had to fight their way back to the steamboats that had brought them down because the Confederates had gotten between us and the river. And we fought our way in, and I told the troops, we'll fight our way out. And they did. When we got back to the boats, I remembered that there was a regiment sent down the riverbank to serve as our flank, and I jumped my horse. I had a horse shot out from under me, and was indeed on a horse that I'd gotten from a staff member. So I've had a horse shot out from under me. I bolted down the riverbank to bring back that regiment, and I went with no escort. I was alone. And when I got there, found out they had seen what was going on with the battle and getting back to the boats, and they'd gone back without orders to the boat. By this time, I've got a considerable number of Confederate troops between me and those boats, and the boats are pulling away from the riverbank to retreat. And I had on an old greatcoat. It was cold. I had on my old greatcoat that was faded and looked like a private soldier. I certainly hope so. And I was riding through a cornfield and trying not to be visible. But about 50 yards away from me, there was a good number of Confederate troops with some officers. And one of them saw me ambling through the cornfield and said, "Yonder, boys, there's a Yankee. Practice your marksmanship on him." And not a one of them raised a musket. It would have been such an easy shot, but not one raised a musket. And I put the spurs to my horse and bolted for those boats and was able to get aboard. Later on, after Fort Donelson, I had taken an entire rebel army and surrendered, about 17,000 men. I was in all of the headlines across the country. It was the first major Union victory in a time of setbacks and defeats. So I went to Nashville after Donelson to try to persuade General Buell to take Nashville before Bedford Forrest, Colonel Forrest, could move supplies out of it and destroy what he couldn't move. A rebel telegrapher had gotten between me and General Halleck in St. Louis, and he wasn't getting my daily reports. He seized upon that opportunity to court-martial me. In fact, I found later that he had telegraphed General McClellan that General Grant is back to his old ways. intimating without saying it that I was in the jug again, which I was not. And General McClellan gamely responded to the effect that if you see fit, court-martial him. So I was relieved of command, placed under house arrest, and about to be court-martialed after I just won the first major victory in the war. President Lincoln was made aware of this by my congressman, Elihu Washburn, who had become my champion, the congressman from Galena, Illinois, where I was living, had lived the year prior to the war. And Congressman Washburn went to see President Lincoln and told him what was afoot. And President Lincoln, who did not know me at the time, but he knew that I'd won that victory and secured the navigation of the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, had Secretary of War Stanton send General Halleck a telegram and told him to tell the president exactly what General Grant had done and exactly where he had done it and exactly when he had done it. Well, upon receipt of this news, they don't call General Halleck old brains for nothing. He immediately, so to speak, closed the drawer on my already completed court-martial papers and telegraphed back to the Secretary of War that, oh no, all of that is just vicious rumor. General Grant has been restored to command, and I look forward to more victories. So I very narrowly escaped court-martial after having taken Forts Henry and Donelson. At Shiloh, some 7 weeks after Donelson, and I'd been promoted to Major General of Volunteers by now, I, on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, was with my engineer, Colonel James B. McPherson, and my quartermaster and supply, Major Watkins. And we were, in the afternoon of the first day, had approached a clearing during the battle, and there were no enemy troops in it. We assumed that it was all right to cross the opening, and we began to cross. Well, we immediately found out that while there were no rebel troops in the field, there were quite a few in the woods, and they vigorously opened fire on us. We spurred our horses and bolted for the safety of the woods. When we got there, the horse that General McPherson, or at that time Colonel McPherson, was riding had been shot through and through behind the saddle in front of the flanks, and within a few minutes dropped dead. Major Watkins had lost his hat in the field, and I would like to point out he did not see fit to go back and retrieve it. And I noticed that I had been hit on my left side just below the pommel of my sword. The metal part of the scabbard had been hit by a mini ball and had nearly severed the blade from the hilt. And in fact, before the day was over, it completely broke off. And had I not had that sword on, and had the mini ball not hit that small inch or so of space, it would have hit me in my hip and shattered my hip and would have been a mortal wound. So because I had my sword on, I took a ball at Shiloh and was merely bruised. I didn't wear a sword again for the rest of the war. I don't like to wear a sword. It just bruises my leg and bothers the horse. But I didn't wear a sword again until the Army was crossing the Rapidan River, May 3rd and 4th of '64. But I took that ball at Shiloh during the day. The aide next to me, sitting his horse next to me, had his head taken off at the neck by a solid ball passing through that missed me by inches. In fact, his his blood and brains were on my uniform. That came that close. And after the Battle of Shiloh, even though many people were clamoring for me to be sacked and cashiered out of the Army, President Lincoln came to my assistance and told cabinet meeting, I can't spare this man, he fights. And that was the end of the matter. However, General Halleck replaced me in command. He didn't relieve me. He tried that at Fort Donelson just weeks before. So while he didn't relieve me of command, he was the commanding general on the field. I was idled and as if I was at the furthest point of my command, had nothing to do and all day to do it every day. Sherman suggested that I ask General Halleck for removing my headquarters relocation. I did, and I was given permission to move to Memphis. So on June the 22nd, I was on the road to Memphis and stopped in Collierville, Tennessee. Saw a gentleman on his porch just off the road and told my very small escort that I'm going to go up and get a cool drink of water. You may ride ahead and I will catch up. I went to the man's porch and he offered me a glass of cold tea. We were sitting there drinking it. One of his neighbors came up. He seemed a bit agitated to introduce me to his neighbor. Mr. Deloche was the gentleman whose home I'd stopped at. But Mr. Deloche stood up and introduced me to Dr. Smith, his neighbor. Dr. Smith nearly backed off the porch when he found out who I was, and within a moment or two made his excuses and left, and I thought at a rather rapid rate. A few minutes later, Mr. Deloche stands up and pretty much says, General, I'm sorry you have to go, but here's your hat. I have to be about my business. And it was abrupt, but I took no offense. He'd been very congenial with me, and I rode on. Caught up with my escort about a mile down the road in the shade of the trees. The captain asked me, do you want to go on into Memphis? And it was in mid-afternoon. And I said, no, let's wait here until the cool of the evening, and then we'll ride on into Memphis. It's not far. And laid down on the ground. I put my hat over my face and napped. General Red Jackson, who was in the area under the command of General Chalmers, under the command of Forrest, Bedford Forrest. Dr. Smith got to him, told him who was in town and where I was. Red Jackson and a troop pounded into Memphis, or into Collierville, I should say. And when they got there to the location, wanted to know where I was, and one of the folks there said, well, he was here, but he left about 45 minutes ago. Jackson decided, with his horses lathered and tired, that, well, and said, if he's got a 45-minute lead on me, I will never be able to catch him. And I saw later General Jackson, Red Jackson, after the war, at his home in Colorado, and spoke with him, visited with him in his home, and we talked to that incident, and I said, if you had only reined your horses to the left and gone but a mile, you would have found me and my escort, just a few men, asleep on the ground without even our weapons in our hands. So I found out later I very narrowly escaped capture in Collierville, Tennessee. After Vicksburg, I was idle. General Halleck was parsing out my army here, there, and everywhere. In fact, I got to the point that I felt that I couldn't defend myself if I was attacked. I'd gone from a juggernaut that captured Vicksburg to an army that I was afraid could not withstand an attack. But in early September, I went to New Orleans upon General Banks' invitation to inspect the troops and get away from the camp for a bit. And on September the 4th, we'd been out to inspect some troops in a town close to New Orleans, and I was riding a magnificent animal, a huge black stallion. Difficult to handle, but beautiful animal. However, a train came by us as the procession is going back into New Orleans. And the engineer, I think, recognized me, but at any rate, he laid down on that whistle right when he was beside me. My horse started, bolted, reared up on his back legs, and that's the last thing I remember. I came to a week or more later in the St. Charles Hotel. What had happened, I was told, the horse fell over on me. Now, I'm proud to tell you, he did not throw me. I was not unseated, but I was under the horse, and I was solidly unconscious. One of the officers in the escort said we thought he was dead. I did have a concussion, and I had severe bruising from my left knee all the way up under my armpit, and that entire part of my body, my left side of my body, was swollen badly. And I was in such pain that I could not even turn myself over in bed. I stayed there for a few days, and finally I felt I had to get back to Vicksburg, and I got back to Vicksburg after being carried in a sling to the steamboat on the wharf and sailing back up to Vicksburg on September the 16th. So I almost was killed by a horse. The last irony that I should point out to you is after the Battle of the Wilderness on May the 7th of 64, after we had pulled back from the first 2 days of savage fighting and were moving on toward Todd's Tavern, Spotsylvania Courthouse, we were going on the Brock Road. Now, I was riding with General Meade. He and I were at the head of the column. It had gotten dark, and we were going past Hancock's command on the Brock Road, and they had moved off the road for wagons to come through. And they were already facing north back to Washington City. And as we rode by, my escort and I rode by, the men recognized us. I think they recognized General Meade with that distinctive hat he wears, and they began to cheer because we were heading south. They were already lined up to go back north. As for the 3 years they'd been fighting, they'd crossed into rebel territory. Lee would maul them, and they'd go back to Washington City. This time, despite the blood and the horror and the butchery that had gone on in the wilderness for 2 days, despite the losses they'd taken, when they saw us, they saw their leadership heading south on the Brock Road, they began to cheer, and a cheer rolled through tens of thousands of men. And one of my staff said cheerfully, "Well, General, it looks like they're cheering you on." And I said, "Yes, they may be, but that needs to stop because they're making such a racket that Lee is going to think that we're attacking him from here, and we will have lost the element of surprise." And Lee did indeed hear something, because a tremendous artillery barrage was opened up in our direction. It fell someplace else. We didn't suffer any from the barrage. But after the cheering, as we were going through the darkness, we came to a fork in the road. Now, we were following Sheridan's route to Todd's Tavern, but we were unfamiliar with the territory, and we took the road that forked to the right. And in the darkness, we're plodding along. But one of the staff there, Colonel C.B. Comstock, was not comfortable. He had the feeling that we were going the wrong way, and said as much and asked to go ahead, and was granted permission, and he dashed off in the darkness and came back in just a few minutes and said, "General, you must turn around. If you keep going on this route, you're going to go right into Lee's army, and you'll be captured. And they're not far up the road. We must act quickly." I didn't want to turn around. It's my custom never to retrace my steps, but There was no other way to go, and temporarily we backtracked until we got back to the Brock Road and moved on south to go to Todd's Tavern. So the same, within minutes of being cheered about going south after the wilderness instead of going back to Washington City, I very nearly rode into Confederate lines and would have been captured. So those are some of the ironies of my life, which I puzzle over and I marvel, because any one of them, as you might well think, had it gone the other way, my life would have been totally different. And I think the term the ironic man is an apt one for me. But I've said quite enough about ironies in my life. Until we come together again and I reflect on a part of my life or career, I am General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you adieu.